Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Rod Martin, founder and CEO of Martin Capital and the Rod Martin Report. Rod is an investor, technology entrepreneur, and futurist. He was part of PayPal's pre-IPO startup team, served as special counsel to founder and CEO Peter Thiel, and also served as policy director for former Governor Mike Huckabee. He's active in a variety of charitable and education endeavors, including service on the board of directors for the Center for Security Policy, on the board of advisors for Liberty University School of Business, and co-founder of the Conservative Baptist Network. He's also chairman of the Martin Foundation and the Institute for American Future. Well, Rod, that's quite the background ride, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, as I forewarned in our pre-show, we like to invite our guests to share a little bit about who they are before we get into how they think. One of my fun trick questions that frequent audience members will know is, when you were in third grade and teacher said, "What did you want to do when you grew up?" Did you say, "I want to be on the pre-IPO team for PayPal"?
I definitely did not. I wouldn't have imagined such a thing, but it just worked out that way. And I actually went to law school. I was policy director for Governor Huckabee, as you mentioned. That was my first job out of law school. And then shortly after that, got a call from Peter Thiel, and he's a friend, and we have mutual friends and so forth. And I ended up going to work for him. And that was just phenomenal. He's an amazing guy. The team was an amazing team. Obviously, there was something in the water. Everybody in Silicon Valley comes from PayPal at this point. And since then, I've been leading Martin Capital, also served on the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention. And we're extremely committed to getting the truth out through the Rod Martin Report at rodmartin.org.
Well, I've been a follower of those messages, and so I've really, really looked forward to today's conversation to get into some of the meat of it that I think would be of great interest to China Desk audience members. But before we do that, going into that tech startup, that ecosystem, maybe share a little bit about what a day in the life was like in that kind of work before you sort of moved on to some of these policy issues and people start thinking about PayPal while you're just sort of managing transactions online. I mean, it was revolutionary in its own way. Talk a little bit about what that experience was like and how it sort of laid a foundation for what you do now.
Well, it was revolutionary. There was nothing like it in the world. There were some things that were attempting to be what it became. And once we got into the field, we drew quite a bit of competition, including from companies like AOL back at its height, and Citibank, and Wells Fargo, and others. My goodness, Wells Fargo's been transmitting money since the Pony Express. So, obviously a bunch of 20-somethings weren't going to get anywhere, but we did. And it was very successful. 0 to 25 million customers in 2.5 years, completely changed the internet in just countless ways. And of course, we're doing this largely during the tech bust. So our IPO was the first technology pure play IPO coming out of the tech bust. And then we had a really good exit with eBay in October of 2002. So yes, it's a very formative experience for everybody involved.
Well, sort of as a preview of where my thoughts evolved over looking at China and how the world interacts with China, the role that technology and finance and business plays in all of that, a little bit tied into this. I mean, really, through the tech boom in the 90s, we believed that technology was moving and communications were moving so fast. And through this new web of interconnectedness, that would be overwhelming to the authoritarians of the world. This was like the new phase of libertarianism in a way, the final frontier of freedom going out there. And there are a lot of hopes and dreams vested on that. And looking at dealing with China, a lot of bets were made that if we just unleash a bit of this internet technology, globalization, and kind of the business integration of all of this, that we might grow our way out of our problems, and that technology would itself be liberating. Without putting words in your mouth or filling too many blanks in before we get deeper into the China conversation, did you have sort of a similar impression coming up through those times that this is the force that technology and information might have on the world, to include China, back in those heady days?
Well, it is those things to a degree, but of course, it's all operated by humans, and humans are fallen. As a Christian, my belief is that men are sinners, and we have a sin nature, and we tend toward corruption, absent the regenerating work of Jesus Christ. And so it isn't surprising to me that our technology would get used against us, because that's just the whole history of the world. But it doesn't change the fact that it is, in fact, liberating. There are children in West Africa who, when I was a kid, were starving, and now they're getting college educations on an iPhone that's powered by a solar battery, and they're getting their internet through Starlink. And I mean, these things are just incredible. So I think in general, the trend line is up, but we're going to have to fight the battle again and again and again. And we've seen that here in the United States. We were moving very rapidly, in my view, into a very soft totalitarianism. If Elon Musk had not purchased Twitter exactly when he did, I'm not sure we could have had anything you would recognize as a free election in 2024. But he restored freedom of speech and pushed all these other social media firms to move in the right direction too. I think we have to all take personal responsibility for the things we're able to do to advance liberty. And liberty is essential precisely because we're sinners. You must not let any one person or small group of people amass so much power that they can use it to dominate the rest. That is the genius of the American system.
Well, I really like that framing. And I think it's a really, really important reminder of the duality of the power of information and technology to do great good. And if we're not constantly gardening to make sure that it is doing good and address the fallibility of mankind, then we fall into a sense of darkness. And I also believe that if free speech hadn't been protected in America, and technology stopped from that total control, it would have been lost everywhere, not just in America. Yes. America was the last great hope on that. So completely agree. So need to get back into the how this applies to the China experiment. And I think it does directly apply to the China experiment. But I want to first move along your journey of you're doing this amazing tech work. You're getting involved in the America project, so to speak, more broadly. But somewhere along the line, I noticed in your commentary, you were talking a lot about what's happening in China. What drew you into that conversation in a significant way?
I've been fascinated with China since high school. I had a teacher who had a Fulbright scholarship to go over there and do some enrichment in the People's Republic in the mid 80s. And she came back and put me on a special research project. I ended up taking Mandarin in college, and it's always been a bit of a passion. And of course, the sadness of the whole thing is the degree to which the United States was complicit in letting Mao take power in the first place. Chiang Kai-shek was not a perfect man, but he was a Christian, actually, which is just amazing. The top leadership of the Republic of China was not only moving rapidly toward the West, but was actually itself Christian. And these people very much shared our values in countless ways. They were just beset from all sides. The Civil War broke out in 27, but they had been in a state of chaos and warlordism since the Qing Empire fell. And then the Japanese invade and they're fighting the communists all through that. And then the instant the Japanese are done, the Soviets hand all the Japanese weapons to Mao. So they spend the next 3 years in a civil war. There's just no end to the sadness of our letting that country fall into the communist mire.
Yeah, it is one of the travesties of history. And of course, I think some subsequent decisions prolonged the communist rule. And in some ways, the bet that we made in the Cold War to balance against the Soviet Union, and then after the supposed end of the Cold War, doubling down on it's the economy stupid kind of way of thinking.
Oh, yes.
We
Yes.
prolonged what could have been a natural transformation of a great culture and civilization toward freedom. But let's fast forward a little bit into some of the current events that I know you've touched upon. And I'd really like to draw your perspective into the window you've had into some of the key players dealing in technology and finance that have big plays in the China market. We are in what some have called a trade war. I might argue that we've been on the receiving end of economic warfare for a long time, have just sort of decided we might return volley in the current season. But if we take that as a proposition, you did a piece that talked about China can't afford a trade war and Trump knows it. You mentioned things about fragile real estate markets and demographic trends make it uniquely vulnerable to tariffs. Maybe share a little bit about some of those structural weaknesses that you were teasing out in that argument.
But I've talked a lot about that on Fox Business also. The truth of the matter is China is an export-driven economy. Most of our foreign trading partners are. In the German case, for instance, 48% of their GDP is exports. They cannot sustain a long-term trade war with somebody who is a chief buyer. And that's the brilliance of Donald Trump, to just look at it and say, look, the emperor has no clothes. What are we doing here? This is the largest consumer market in the world. It's 4% of global population, but 26% of global GDP. Everybody should be treating us well just to get to do business in the American market. And instead, we have all these lopsided trade deals from the Cold War era that made sense at the time. I mean, we needed to rebuild the world. We needed to help keep our allies on side. We certainly needed to pry China away from the Soviet Union. The Kissinger foreign policy made sense. There was at least a logic to Jimmy Carter's treatment of China, although I'm horrified by it. But Bill Clinton went in this just insane direction of let's just give them the store. And let's build a superpower in a country that clearly is opposed to everything we stand for. And the hope, of course, was, and we heard unendingly, that this would bring about liberalization in China. But no, we just made totalitarians rich. And we can relitigate that, but we are where we are. Donald Trump understands this is a mortal enemy. It's one of the few countries in the world that could actually follow through on saying routinely they want to nuke American cities, which is just unthinkable. Can you imagine if an American leader said such a thing? And we can't treat these people like friends. We don't have to treat them ugly. We certainly want to have a good trading relationship with them, but we do not wish to empower them. And that is the great lesson of Reagan. Reagan worked out the deal with the Saudis that ended up collapsing the price of oil and starving the Soviet Union of hard currency. And that was a key component of winning the Cold War. Donald Trump was paying attention. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
So if the model that they have now and some of the core trends internally are unsustainable, and if we are in a period of significant rebalancing, which all evidence points to yes, we are. What does that do to the risk calculus in the near-term years ahead? China going through that kind of experience could be kind of provocative, or it could be rational and make a deal that is on offer from a president who, by all indications, wants to de-escalate tensions and kind of define a new, more stable normal between the two countries. So maybe correct any of those assumptions, or share what your thinking is on teasing out whether those trends taken as a given, does that make things riskier or maybe opportunities better?
No, you're right in both directions. There are some pretty tremendous opportunities here, but the reality is the next decade is the most dangerous. The Chinese regime is not unaware of its demographic disaster. It has shifted from a one child policy to now outright pronatalism, and it's not moving the dial. They're at about a 1.0 total fertility rate. It takes 2.1 just to maintain your population. They're probably going to stabilize around 0.8. At that rate, by the end of the century, they've lost 75% of their population. The United States will actually have a larger population at the end of the century, unless something changes that I don't believe can. We will be a larger country than they are, and which is just staggering. And it works through the system in some pretty ugly ways. It destroys the real estate market. It destroys construction. It destroys consumption because everybody's money is getting spent on taking care of elderly parents. And there aren't enough young people to do it. They've overcounted their population by about 100 million right now, and 100% of that 100 million is in the working class, or in the working age cohort. So they're really in a bind. And there are opportunities for us to be beneficial to them, but only on terms that make it safe for us to do so. We can't have this global competition over basically military supremacy. That's got to stop. So Trump is decoupling for that purpose. He's decoupling in part so that, we can bring pharmaceuticals home and other things that we really have to do here, like rare earths. But the aim isn't to not trade with China. The aim is to starve them of the cash necessary for them to invade Taiwan or invade Siberia or whatever. And that's a perfectly reasonable goal.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about what some people might see as the countervailing forces in the scenarios that we're looking at. Obviously, demographics are what they are, but they have been blessed to be on the receiving end of a shower of technology transfer and financial transfer over multiple decades. Arguably was the fuel that launched them ahead in military modernization, technology advantages, and for better and I would argue worse, much of the world choosing to make China the manufacturing platform for seemingly all of humanity. And so how do some of those advantages help Beijing maybe insulate against the pressure to make a deal with a President Trump or try to stave off decoupling?
In the long run, they really have a problem they can't solve. And, I feel bad for them, actually. It is a self-inflicted wound. Mitigation, however, is very possible. Robotics is a big part of that solution. And we're already seeing that in places like Japan that have already faced this demographic cliff. Japan is doing wonders with technology-based agriculture, with basically self-driving tractors that are better at farming than a human would be. That's important because otherwise their farms would just go empty. They don't have people to farm anymore. So they're driving that technology. That can help China. We're seeing deployment of robotics in Shenzhen and other places that are really quite staggering because those things don't take a break. They don't go on strike. They don't take vacations. And so there's a lot of benefit that can come from that. The problem is they also don't buy cars. and they don't buy condominiums. And so there's a limit to the utility. You can increase productivity, you can't increase consumption. So it actually doubles down on the problem. China becomes even more dependent on exports. And so the danger in this next decade, especially, is very real.
So, do you see any signs of the Chinese leadership moderating any of what it is saying or doing to try to steer in the direction of maybe backing off of the wolf warrior ethos and this somewhat nationalist first kind of approach from a Communist Party point of view that's kind of dominated coverage over the last decade? Do you see any bending of that arc in the interactions so far?
Yes, very much so. I mean, they're not going to say it. Xi Jinping has done everything in his power to cast himself as the man who will stand up to America. And he just can't back down from that verbally. He won't be president forever. And there have been some intriguing signs of possibility of his rule being challenged a bit over there in the last few months. But regardless, at some point, a new leadership is likely to be in a position, probably casting it as she being, off base and out of line with party doctrine, and we're charting this more authentic Maoist Leninist course that won't be. And I think there is that possibility. We do have to get over this next decade's hump. But as a practical matter, they just agreed to Donald Trump's trade deal. And okay, they're still holding out on military grade rare earths. That's probably foolish. That's just making sure that we do develop them. And you saw the deal today with Apple and MP Materials. The Pentagon's putting an investment in that. I have mixed emotions about that, but I understand what they're trying to do is about a 15% stake in the company. Not loving that, but I appreciate them focusing on rare earths refining and mining here in the United States. That's long overdue. And so you start seeing some trends that decouple, but the most telling thing is the deal they agreed to, which maintains 55% tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States versus just 10% on US goods going into China. That's just a surrender. And they're bowing to reality here. It may make sense for them to invade somebody, but short of deciding that, which I suspect could be avoided, short of deciding that, they've got to do business, and they have to do business with us. There's no avoiding it. And Donald Trump is also doing a great job of ringing them in with these deals, such as with Vietnam and now with Indonesia, where we're going to hit those countries with huge tariffs in the event of Chinese transshipment. So they can't really get around it. And now we're talking about secondary tariffs or secondary sanctions because of Russia continuing its war. Now, I'm a free trader, so I have mixed emotions about all of this. Mm-hmm. But if we can use tariffs to bring about a more level playing field and accomplish some things on a national security basis that must be accomplished, I think it's an overwhelming net positive, at least in the near term. What I don't want to end up with is a situation like we had in the 70s, where because of trade barriers, American automobiles came to just be terrible. And, the whole economy is stifled through industrial policy. That we must avoid.
Yeah, well, I'm all for free trade when it promotes freedom.
Right.
I don't want free trade that invests and empowers in attacks on freedom. And I think that was the very slow sobriety checkpoint we passed at somewhere along the way in the China bet. And maybe not everyone's on board, but an awful lot of America and a lot of the rest of the world at some point clicked in that, it's one thing to have unfettered exchange of goods and services, but when they start to get stolen and they start to get invested in advanced weaponry that's now encroaching on our sovereignty, this is not freedom. That is,
No, not at all. And in fact, they're doing exactly what Lenin told us they would do. We're selling them the rope with which they hang us.
yeah.
And we adopted this somewhat honestly libertarian fantasy that everyone is equally and entirely motivated by the bottom line. And that's simply not true. The Ayatollah is motivated by the bottom line, but that's not his dominant motivation. Xi Jinping's primary motivation is not the bottom line. And honestly, neither is anybody else's. Obviously, the economy can be used as a tool to advance freedom in countless ways. And that's certainly what we did at PayPal. I mean, I said we went from 0 to 25 million customers in 2.5 years. What I didn't say was we facilitated the creation of 2 million small businesses in that same 2.5 years, which is freedom for all those people. We can use the market to achieve that, but our enemies are going to view it as a battle space, not a marketplace. And they are going to use capitalism against itself wherever they can. That's where American power becomes essential to level the playing field and to keep things in check.
Yeah, well, let's pivot a little bit into what you see as some of the principles and guardrails for where we ought to be going as we look at interactions with China going forward. Obviously, to the extent that technology can be empowering and liberating and used for human good, we want to see that go out, including into controlled societies that maybe could be less controlled over time. But obviously, we have to have some principles or guardrails. One of the principles that we've talked about on almost every episode of the China Desk is the principle of reciprocity and what role that should play as a guide for how we think and how we make decisions about our interactions with China. What do you think the role ought to be in U.S.-China investment, trade, manufacturing, whatever the case may be? What role should a principle of reciprocity play in our thinking?
Oh, you're exactly right. And and that just is a needed update. That's where we should have been in the 90s when instead we decided to give away the store. And yet, we talk about a peace dividend. The peace dividend we should have had is fairer trade deals where Germany isn't charging us 4 times the tariff on our automobiles that we're charging them. That's absurd. Why would you ever allow that? Likewise, in India, they've got 100% tariff on Harley Davidson. Well, that doesn't mean they're collecting taxes on sales of Harleys. That means there are no sales of Harleys. Just like when you have a 280% tariff in Canada on certain dairy goods. It just means our farmers don't get to compete in Canada. So that's not free trade. That's not capitalism. That is state central planning in our so-called trade partners. And Trump is insisting on reciprocity, just as you suggest, for exactly that reason. We don't have a problem with 0-0 tariff regimes. The president said it plain as day at the G7 in 2018. That's not the issue. The issue is it has to be fair. We're going to charge no tariff on Indian motorcycles if they charge no tariff on American motorcycles and so forth. And there may be some adjustments to that depending on other circumstances, such as the situation in Ukraine, such as China's threats against Taiwan, such as fentanyl, such as the border. But that's just using national policy in a way calculated to provide for the common defense. We've completely decoupled economics from that constitutional mandate.
So when we look at reciprocity with China in particular, you couldn't go to China and start a PayPal.
No. And if you did, it would be owned by the government, at least in large part, and it would be completely controlled by the government. They wouldn't necessarily appoint your board, but there'd be a couple guys in the back of the boardroom whose diktat you must obey. And that's been the case all this time. Everybody's just kind of sucked it up and dealt with it because they're making so much money. But money isn't everything. And money in the service of social credit scores is actually destroying freedom, not helping it.
So I want to, in our sort of closing phase of the conversation, talk a little bit about an area that I imagine we might have a shared interest in taking two big parts of life and the world and putting them together into the China conversation that's not just about tech, but about human dignity. And it's one of the reasons why I think that reciprocity and rebalancing is necessary, but also strategic decoupling is necessary, because you can't have an artificial intelligence driven world if the foundational stack doesn't protect free speech and human dignity, allow for the part of life that makes man saved, not fallen. And so it's these things are not going to be negotiated in trade deals, but they matter to the kind of world we're choosing to live in. And so, to me, as I look at the challenge from China, it's supply chains and leverage and dependencies. Surely there could be military contingencies. All of that is a part of the life that I've lived in policy and government. But the part that is beyond that, the initial outreach to China was a commercial impulse, yes, but also a missionary impulse, of a desire to save souls, open minds, an inherent belief that we are all children of the same God, and you want to have that be a bridge to a better future. All the talk that we might have about the threat environment, whatever the malign influences are of the Chinese Communist Party, there's still a part of who we are and what we're about that cares about the well-being of the Chinese people, would like this connection for a better future to be able to flourish, but it's been blocked in some very, very disappointing ways. Maybe share a little bit about what your experience was, because just given your bio, I strongly suspect these thoughts have weighed on your mind as you've watched the explosion of information and technology and opportunity, but also the changing nature of U.S. China's realities.
Oh, without a doubt. And you mentioned the missionary impulse. The missionary endeavor in China was shockingly successful for about a century. And of course, one of the first things the communists did was get rid of all the missionaries. But the missionaries had been very successful in increasing the dignity of human life, in building hospitals and all kinds of useful functions in China that wouldn't have existed without them. And of course, estimates range between 100 and 200 million Christians in China today. So, nobody really knows what the number is, but that seems likely to be true. We believe necessarily that China, the Chinese people, are under the thumb of a totalitarian overlord. And that has to cease. Now, we're not going to go nuke them. We're not going to go in and do regime change like it's 20 years ago. That's not the point. But we can use our disproportionate economic power to build a military sufficiently strong that, in Morton Blackwell's words, we make the steel more expensive than it's worth, and they don't go to war. And likewise, we can use trade to facilitate better behavior. I loved J.D. Vance's line that, no free trade without free speech. And, that was aimed at our European allies who have diminished basic human liberty far, far more than I think most Americans appreciate. And it's happened very rapidly. And that has to be reversed. America's influence can be very positive in that regard, while doing deals that make sense and increase everybody's wealth. I don't know how you could have a better outcome than that. And I think it ultimately averts maybe not all war, but most of them.
Well, we certainly want to get to a place where we are doing what the president has talked about, which is stopping war, expanding opportunity, certainly American revival, but that revival extends to our allies if they play fair and play along. But ultimately, a world where hopefully the Chinese Communist Party has less influence, and maybe the Chinese people have a better alternative path to a future. But Rod, if there are any parting thoughts you have, I'd welcome you to share them, and also let people know where they should go to learn more about your research and follow your commentary.
Well, we believe in liberty. We believe that man is made in the image of God and therefore has dignity that the state may not infringe. And we believe that that's the best outcome for all mankind. We don't want to impose it on them. We just want to help them to find it. And we do that all day, every day at rodmartin.org. That's rodmartin.org. The Rod Martin Report, and of course on my X at Rod D. Martin. And I think most of your audience would be very pleased with what they find.
Well, Ron, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Appreciate you taking the time to share your experience and ideas with the China Desk audience. To our audience, if you enjoyed today's conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. We welcome your feedback and suggestion for other guests we might bring into the conversation. We thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Rod Martin for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.